Welcome to another episode of Natural 2, where two naturally nerdy individuals discuss D&D topics and I guess tabletop role-playing topics in general. I am Nathan, your friendly neighborhood forever DM, and this is my partner in crime.
James, player of Valorant and Asmiliath Adventures, and player of Tabletop since 3.5.
He brings the wisdom, I bring the charm, supposedly. I think that's the deal that we have struck. But today we are going to hopefully be discussing something a little bit more problematic, maybe a bit more controversial. Controversial. That's a good way of starting it off. So that there isn't as much cut and dry advice and a bit more dialogue we have back and forth. But what are we discussing today, James?
So we're talking about the problem of role playing, specifically whether to pressure or push or encourage the players at your table to attempt it or engage with it more.
A topic or a part of the dialogue that I think would be really interesting to go through initially. When you say, "Oh, I'm gonna go into D&D or I'm gonna go into a session in roleplay," I think there is a community understanding of that term. I think there's an actual definition of that term, and I think there's also how people personally interpret that term. So I was gonna ask you right off the bat, what do you think the community understanding is when that term is used? And what would you describe it as when you use that term in a tabletop role playing sense?
So, in terms of the community, I feel like I've seen definitions all over the map, from speaking in a funny voice to really in-depth character interactions to some folks say that role playing is simply the act of playing D&D, and if you're playing D&D, you're role playing. Thinking about your character as a person, motivations, emotions, wants, needs, desires, and playing them according to those that you've established that you're holding in your mind. Speaking in a funny voice, not necessary. I do it because it's fun for me, but accents and things like that, I don't consider to be important to the process. Nor do I think that you're automatically role playing just because you're sitting at a table rolling dice.
Mhm.
You can absolutely still just be yourself moving a game piece around on the table. So
Mhm.
that's what I think.
I went back and read through a ton of how do I get my players to RP, 5 tips to get your players to engage more, all that that block of conversation of the D&D and tabletop role playing community. And there's a lot of, I don't want to say misinformation or misunderstanding, that might be kind of a strong term, but everyone kind of takes their own perception on this topic and then applies it pretty broadly. And the best way I would try and describe this is like if you go to Reddit and you type in, how to get my players to RP more, the person in the post beneath is like, oh, I'd have all these characters and this elaborate story, and they meet the king and they have this huge dialogue, and I have this one player who just, scratches his butt and then says, oh, I try to persuade him, instead of, speaking in a voice. And so I think overall, the community, when you say role playing, they might picture something like the critical role theme or like dialogue, not system, but their back and forth that they usually use, where they're in character and having these lengthy discussions and actually delving into a dialogue that otherwise could be summed up as, oh, we sit down at the bar and we chat about our backstory for 5 minutes. Because
They're putting on a show.
exactly, right? I think a lot of people that watch that and then try and play their own game, especially if you're looking at this in the DM perspective, they're like, oh, why can I make this happen? Why can't my game be like this? I want that. And I think it's a combination of your characters, or your players, I should say, might not want that at all. That might not be the game that they sign up for. That might not be something they even enjoy. And you're looking at, there's also the aspect of they're professionals and you're playing with a bunch of some probably close friends and nerds that probably don't socialize as much as they should. I think it's a combination of expectation and communication and difference in, I don't know, desires in the game itself that leads to this huge fucking mangled conversation of, I want you to talk in a funny voice. I just want to roll my dice. I just want loot. And, that back and forth over and over and over again.
I am a big proponent. I always want to see it, whether I'm playing or running a game, because for me, it's what separates it from just playing an action RPG on the computer.
Hmm.
It's what it's the number one thing that makes it distinct from any other game you could be playing is the story that you are crafting, because Critical Role is putting on a show,
Hmm.
and
As are we with his millionth adventures. Sorry.
that's true too. But even like I feel like even ours is different in the sense
Mhm.
that Critical Role, Dimension 20, all of that ilk are creating an entertainment product.
Yes.
And that's not a criticism at all, so
Hmm.
don't light me up over that.
It's like a show
Um,
first, a game second.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think so. Or at the very least, it's
They're
equal
equal. Yeah. Yeah.
equal terms of both. So everything that they do should be viewed through that lens.
Mhm.
I always think of the games that I've been in over the years as we're putting on a show for ourselves.
Mhm.
We are putting on our own play for the five of us. And so a lot of the choices that I make in terms of role playing or the things that I do with my character, I think of in that way. And I think that that's when the game really can reach its peaks, and become something more than a twist on a tabletop war game or a video game even.
Mhm.
That's when it becomes something that you're gonna remember your whole life. Like we have memories from as Miliath, and I have memories from campaigns before, uh, that I will never forget. And they are not so much about that time when I hit for a lot of damage
Mhm.
or
I
moved into
rolled
that
three
great.
nat 20s in a row.
Right. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's pretty memorable, but it's memorable because of what it meant to the story that we were
Yeah.
telling ourselves.
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of people complain online about how do I play a smart character when I'm not smart, or how do I play
Mhm.
a charismatic character when I'm not charismatic?
Mhm.
And people will respond, commenters will say that, well, your DM's a bad DM. Your DM is like abusing you because we don't tell people to lift weights at the table for a strength check or
Mhm.
to run laps for a constitution check, so they shouldn't ask you what you're going to say in
Mhm.
character. And I think that is really unfortunate, really reductive. It's a big part of the game that I think you're just throwing out.
We might
Uh,
actually disagree on this a fair bit. I have another side of this coin if you don't have any more.
okay. Well, let me
Okay. Yeah.
wrap up this point by
Mhm.
saying that it's sort of like playing basketball, I guess.
Mhm.
But I don't like dribbling. So when we play basketball, I don't want to dribble. Like, all right, I mean, I don't blame you for not being good at dribbling. Everything takes practice, but I want you to at least try. That's
Mhm.
that's all I'm saying. Like, you don't have to be Kobe Bryant. I'm just saying try to bounce the ball. And that's what it means to me is I don't need Critical Role caliber stuff at the table in
Mhm.
order to have fun. I just want to see you, especially if I'm DM, I'm gonna keep putting things in front of you to try to get it out of you. I want to see you at least have the thought go through your head of my character as an individual with his or her own motivations and desires.
So let me put forth a question then, coming off of that comment. If you're DMing a game and there's a player that you are in your game that has vocalized to you on multiple occasions that he doesn't want to do a voice, he probably doesn't even want to do the actual dialogue of his character, but he approaches some NPC or he's going shopping, and he says, "All right, here's what I'm gonna say to them," and you go, "Well, why not? Like, what would you actually say?" And he's like, I really don't want to, but like, this is what my character would say or loosely say because this is the kind of person he is. Is that enough of a olive branch to you that they are at least theming their response in their character's perspective to like check off the box of RPing? Or would you still push them further to be like, come on, get in the voice, let's do this kind of thing?
I think that is enough, especially if it's somebody who's not totally comfortable or who's new to the
Mm-hmm.
experience. There again, I don't think the voice is important
Mm-hmm.
necessarily. You don't have to put on an accent. I just want to see that thought put
Mm-hmm.
into it. So I would be, especially if it's somebody that's really just trying it out and trying to, be more comfortable. I would be happy for them
Mm-hmm.
to say, my character says XYZ. It also gives me something to go off of. If I'm DM,
Mm-hmm.
like if you just say, I roll persuasion and you roll an 18,
Mm-hmm.
now I've got to not only make up what my NPC is going to say, but what
Mm-hmm.
you said.
Mm-hmm.
So at least give me that much. At least say, this is the crux of my character's argument. If you only ever speak in third person, especially at a start, my character XYZ, I can work with that. I'm not going to give you a hard time or you know, try to push you too much farther out of your comfort zone, because that at least represents an attempt. I think what I see in online conversations a lot of the time are people who just want to say, I roll persuasion,
Mm-hmm.
and just all you've got to work with is the number.
Mm-hmm.
And then people being angry that they would ever be asked for a little more than that. And I think it's the same. It's the same thing with combat. Combat is more interesting if the DM takes the time to say how hard somebody was hit
Mm-hmm.
or which body part they were hit in. It's the same thing. It's a
Mm-hmm.
social encounter version of that.
Going back to the topic that you kind of mentioned earlier, where my character has a 20 strength, but I can't lift 4,000 pounds, so I shouldn't have to do this charismatic dialogue or this intellectual dialogue. There's a really brief example from a game that I played in, which I think explains my thoughts on this perfectly. This wasn't me; it was another player in the game. Goes to a shop, he's trying to barter to get a better price, and his character is built for this. That's a lot of the aspect of not only his backstory, but the mechanics on his sheet. And he goes to the guy and he's like, oh, I'm going to roll a persuasion check to try and get a lower price on this. And he does have like a back and forth in character dialogue with the shopkeeper. It wasn't anything super insane, but it was just like a very casual back and forth. And after he rolled and, the conversation concluded, he was like, oh, did I get a better price? And the DM goes, no, you didn't say the right things. And that really rubbed me the wrong way, because while I understand where the DM's mind is in that moment, where like, oh, you didn't, touch upon his dead child's, love for dolls or whatever to unlock his secret trait. And I think he rolled pretty high, I think it was like an 18 or something. When your character, there's a little bit of a meta conversation to be had here, but when someone builds their character for a specific thing, and you just don't let them succeed at that thing, especially when you lock it behind the gate of you must RP this well before I allow you to play this aspect of your character. That's when we start getting into almost like a toxic gatekeeping, that's the word I'm looking for, of you must RP my way, you must approach things my way, or I'm not going to let you play this game. And I think there's a fair amount of that in this conversation, where a lot of the advice I saw in these videos and these posts that I looked up were, oh, don't let them level up, or, only give them these rewards if they do this, or give them inspiration die. And while some of those things are good, and I would say rewarding players for RPing is a really good way of drawing some people out, locking things off from them until they do something, which is some of the advice that I saw, is a horrible way of approaching this, because now they're just going to be bitter that, oh, I don't get to level up until I talk to my dad. What are you on about? That would be something that I think a lot of people might need to hear. Maybe a little bit of a bitter pill that might need to be swallowed, is you gotta be very selective on how you apply your perspective of role playing to your players, and how you try and draw them out, and what rewards and drawbacks you may offer based on what you expect from them, if that kind of makes sense.
I think that this is probably its own episode topic in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Being a good DM requires flexibility. It
Mm-hmm.
requires thinking on your feet. It requires judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're trying to get something out of someone else at your table, the right way, in my opinion, is to be aware of where they are and be willing to meet them where they are, Like I would be happy that somebody is making the attempt. And if you have to come 3/4 of the way, at least they came a quarter of the way.
Hmm.
And be willing to make them be willing to be encouraging, make them feel good about making the attempt instead of being overly critical of the quality of that attempt because they're learning. They're learning. It's a skill like anything else, like any other game has skills and strategies and methods.
Kind of twisting that topic of, kind of overall just being a generally good DM, the way that I very loosely define that is you're the curator of fun at the table. You are the one in charge of guiding the story, saying no and saying yes to certain things to help produce the most amount of enjoyment from your players as possible. That's kind of your job when you sit down. Putting that in the RP conversation that we are having, it might be a rather unpopular opinion, but RP can go too far. You can indulge yourself too much. It can start holding back the game in a broader sense than it adds to it. And I even have a fair bit of experience with this. When we first started our campaign, before we started releasing the episodes publicly, there were tons of sessions where they just sat around and shopped and talked to stupid NPCs that just went nowhere. And we didn't achieve anything. And while, they had fun with the inside jokes and they would chase down, these weird mishmash characters that I had to build on the fly, it didn't add to the story at large. They weren't coming away from the game with this, like, oh, we achieved this, we got here, my character, made it to this impactful moment, or like I even leveled up if that's the kind of player that you are. There was no progression, and so while they were having fun in the moment, it wasn't making a good game overall. And I think that's also something that people might want to ask themselves or kind of analyze your game over whenever you finish a session is like, did we really have to have 45 minutes of shooting the shit in the tavern at the beginning of the session? Did that really go anywhere? Did that add anything? Were there players left out that don't enjoy RPing? That was one of the common criticisms I saw in some of the posts that I read through and some of the videos that I watched, all the comment sections beneath them, is, oh, I'm a player in this game and I just tune out whenever, we go into a tavern and we stop for the night because I know nothing's going to be achieved. I go and make a burrito or something. And so that's also something you should be keeping your finger on the pulse of, being a good DM and looking at this topic.
It does take some practice to get a sense as a player of when to shut up,
That's very important.
or to hand the baton to someone else, and
Mhm.
to get a sense as DM of when to say, anyway, the next morning, you guys awaken to blah blah blah. I think people are way too worried about Critical Role and other
Mhm.
shows like that, and spend too much time thinking about them in general. But if there's one thing that maybe people who have come to the hobby because of those shows are struggling with, it's this idea that they're supposed to spend that much time talking.
Mhm.
There again, those guys are putting on a show and they're professional performers
Mhm.
who, in at least half the time, are genuinely funny.
And also have
Uh,
amazing chemistry, like way more chemistry than any year groups are probably ever going to have. Is something to
yeah,
also
that's
put
true
out
as
there.
well.
Yeah.
That's true as well. Well, there's two married couples in the show,
Yeah, and they've
and
been playing for what, almost like 10 years now, something like
at
that.
least point
Yeah.
being, getting a sense of when it's not necessary, you've made your point and it's time to move on, or as a
Mhm.
DM, when it's time to urge things along and say, yeah, I get it, we're going to the next scene. Something else that I think is an important question to ask yourself: am I funny? Well, are you, punk? No, I think that there's I'm not sure what it is exactly. I think it's a comfort thing. It's an old gag that your D&D campaign starts out Lord of the Rings and ends up Monty Python Quest for the Holy Grail. Like, I
Mhm.
think that's literally a meme that I've seen on the internet. Whether it's to try to reduce tension or because they're uncomfortable in the situation and they need a defense mechanism, people want to make non-stop jokes and be try to be funny. That's not it either. I'm gonna draw a line in the sand and say that's also not that's not automatically role playing either. If you're trying to make a funny character, that's harder than you think.
Mhm.
And
It's a lot
maybe
more nuanced. Yeah.
maybe take a breath, think about it, ask yourself if you want to try to tell the same joke over and over again for 100 hours.
This is totally off of the topic, but I think it's worth slipping in here because potentially we might have a whole episode on it.
Yeah.
There is a well of content and adventure that is skipped over in D&D because people are not willing to be as vulnerable as the heroes in our epic stories are, right? Imagine a scene in D&D where Frodo and Sam are sitting there basically like, we are dead, but we've gone through all this together. I love you so much. The bond that we have will never be broken. That's a hard thing for two strangers on the internet to do in a D&D game. And so it's hard to have those moments in the game when people aren't willing to go that deep, go that personal and that vulnerable. And I'm not saying that like everybody should be just exposing their hearts when they sit down at the table, but that is something that I find lacking in a lot of the like kind of like service level D&D games that I've seen or that I've played in. So that could potentially be a much larger topic.
And I think that's what, to bring it back around to the original point, if you let your role-playing scenes or your dialogue meander, 9 times out of 10, that's where it's going to end up, is pee-pee and poo-poo jokes.
Mm-hmm.
Start developing that sense of when to shut it down and move on.
Which is not always a bad thing. I will shoot that as, humor and, kind of deflecting things is a very human thing to do. It's a great thing to include. Everything has to be balanced. That's the key to most things in D&D, is knowing when that's appropriate and when it's not, or when there's been too much of that. So
Lord of the Rings has some genuinely funny moments, but it's there to add. Yeah.
You touched upon briefly in your description of what role-playing is to you or to the community at large, that it isn't just dialogue and social encounters. It also applies to the game and combat and exploration as well. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't hear enough, or it isn't talked about enough, is combat is role-playing. Unless you completely remove yourself from your character, there are individuals who sit down at the table and say, I want to deal this much damage. This is the optimal way to finish this combat. I don't care even what the name of my token on the board is. I'm just going to beat the big bad thing and get the treasure at the end. There are people like that. But the vast majority of us, I would say, probably sit down at the table, have some sense of what your character is thinking in that moment. And while you might not be 100% faithful of, oh, he's terrified of spiders, so he's not going to go towards them, you are at least considering that. You're thinking about that, and you're approaching it, even if it's just the slimmest sliver of mortality, where you're like, oh, I don't want my guy to die. You're role-playing to an extent. It's very slim, but it's there. And so that applies across the entire game when you are approaching any scenario. Combat, exploration, social, whatever, survival. You are role-playing in a more technical way. Can add just as much as some funny voice in a dialogue.
Definitely, and it adds meaning. As a player, I like treasure. I like fighting monsters. I'm never as interested in combat as I am when it matters to my character. Like I struggle with if somebody's out, if we're not able to have our regular session and we're just going to have like a danger room scenario where we're just going to play a combat
for combat's sake.
For combat's sake, I struggle with that.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy the mechanics of the game. I like making characters. I like trying to be good at combat, but it's never as much fun as it is when I have that undercurrent of, I have been chasing this guy, over the continent. I really want to get him this time. Or I'm angry and my character wants to work out some frustration or show this other character up because they have this rivalry. Like, that is the stuff that makes it matter whether you're good at combat or not. That's what makes it important that you can really hammer that bad guy after all the terrible things he's done. Yeah, there is no part of the campaign that it shouldn't or couldn't touch.
Early on in our campaign, I ran some random encounter tables of you're traveling down the road and you run into this. And there was this one fight in particular where they came across a bandit party and they, ambushed them, wanted their money. It was a bad part of the country. And it was the most empty and meaningless 2 hours of my life I've experienced in quite a long time. They just killed them. That, like, I tried to introduce some dialogue, or like how they ambushed them or how they lured them into like a worse position, and it was so uninteresting to the players because there were just no stakes, right? They knew they weren't going to die. They weren't holding anyone hostage. Like, this was just a bunch of punching meatbags that were just harassing them. And while you can play that as a player, kind of like finally having some, something to take their aggression out on, as you mentioned earlier, they were just bored and they just weren't interested in it, and it was just a waste of everybody's time because it didn't matter to not only the characters but to the players as well. And so if you find yourself having empty combats more often than not, maybe that should be something that you try and put through this lens, is instead of trying to challenge them or get them down to 0 HP or get two of them unconscious, focus more on what are they going to feel when they win? What are the stakes in the background? What is the meaning behind this combat besides I rolled a 68 on the DM chart, right? Like, that, I think, provides a whole different experience than just enjoying the mechanics of combat or just enjoying the reward of getting 30 XP for slaying the bandit guy.
Still thinking on your feet as DM,
Mhm.
right? Like, if this combat is going nowhere, maybe the last three guys see that they're getting their butts kicked and
Mhm.
run.
Yeah.
You know, that there's no rule that says that the combat has to go until those guys
Mhm.
are dead. They can disappear into the foliage and never be seen again, or run to the next village talking about the horrible monsters that are coming down the road.
So I want to try and shift the conversation from that to what are the best ways to answer the question that's kind of been talked about to death, but at least from our perspective, what are the best ways, or what are the best approaches to get your players to engage more, to RP more, and again, not focusing on just the dialogue, but focusing as RPing as a whole for the entire game.
I'm a fan of the questionnaires that I briefly mentioned in our last episode.
Hmm.
They're really not hard to find. They're all over the place. Just like 10 questions about your character.
Hmm.
And for newcomers or people who are not really used to role playing very in depth, I think it's a great way to get them started thinking about this person as an individual or as a
Hmm.
person that's different from them. Are you a hero? Why or why not?
Hmm.
Why are you an adventurer? Things that can start those wheels turning. That's one of my favorite ways to start. And even if you're a seasoned role player, it's a good tool for bringing some of those ideas into focus. Starting small
Hmm.
as DM, or even if you are a player, looking for opportunities to just sort of extend a hand. Characters that ask them questions or that remark on something about them.
Hmm.
If you've got a player playing a Warforged who is not a strong role player, that's an in to just have a little kid in the village wander up to them and say, are you alive? And it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be a 40-minute conversation. Just, 6 sentences
Hmm.
back and forth and then move on before they have a chance to get stumped. I think that's the other thing is don't, you're not trying to stump your player. So if they run out of things to say, move on. Um,
Hmm.
don't put them under a microscope. If they run out of things to say or if they get uncomfortable, then it's your job as DM to move the spotlight somewhere else before they have time to leave that session thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm so anxious. That was so anxiety
Hmm.
inducing. I hate this game."
One of the biggest pieces of advice that I think apply to this conversation is the majority of this should be discussed outside of the session or before the session. It is probably less than ideal to surprise people with this or to drop it on them without any sort of expectation. There are ways or smaller, what's the term that you used before, like invitations to kind of try and lure some feedback from them. And that, you don't have to like sit there and lay it out with them beforehand. But if you are about to play a session and you know that you are kind of focusing in on this person to open up a bit more about their character, just tell them that. say, hey, I've found that with the rest of the party that we really don't know much about Sir X or Mrs. Y. Like, what do they do? How do they function? Would you mind if, like, we kind of delve into that a little bit today, especially if you're, like, going to their hometown or something similar. But the easiest tips I would give people for beginning this process to kind of just creeping into that subject with people is there's a lot of archetypes or stereotypes of players, right? The ones that just want magical loot, or the ones that are way too into their backstory, or ones that, want to be the funniest guy there. And there's a lot of the kind of like stereotypes. There are ways to play to those stereotypes and engage them with RPing or being more immersed with their character, because RPing again is a kind of broad term that they won't notice at first. The easiest one to point out is someone who's obsessed with combat or obsessed with their character being insanely powerful, like a min-maxer or something of that regard. During combat, when they nuke some goblin to death and he is left as a pile of dust, ask the simple question, what did that look like? And, in Critical Role has been kind of made somewhat famous of, how do you want to do that when they defeat the boss? And that's a really cool thing to do. But you can also slip that in rather mundane encounters, and then you can apply that to other things when they go up and ask for a discount at a merchant shop, or they explore a cave. You can take that, how do you want to do this, or how did that look, and apply it. And their answer might not be some long-winded explanation of the cold wind drifting from the entrance as I held my torch aloft, but at least you get them thinking. Like, yeah, how did that look like? Oh, yeah, the cave's kind of small, so my guy would look really imposing going in. Like, that's enough. That's the seed that you want to plant, and then nurture that if they follow through and want to progress and get more immersed. That would be my approach to this problem.
I guess that we would need to, in fairness, talk about people who are going too far.
That was the
And
last thing on my notes. I was wondering if you wanted to discuss that, so we can
okay.
certainly throw that around.
It's worth a couple of minutes, I guess. It's the point of the video is to try to encourage growth in role play, but
Not an overgrowth.
well, we have to pay lip service to the fact that you can have too much of anything. I have gone too far at the table before.
No, you
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and not I
insert
hope.
clip of.
Yeah, oh geez. I think it was appropriated as Biliath because we have all been on the same page for a while. But I've been at tables with newer players, newer groups, not as well established groups, and I have unloaded with both barrels and created an uncomfortable situation at the table. And it was a long time ago, but wherever you are, I apologize. I think, you know what? I think I can frame this in terms of how to help people role play more or embrace it more. Because if you are the person at your table, like me, who is a gigantic RP dork,
An enthusiast, some would say.
and yeah, and has a lot of experience and does revel in it and is a big part of the fun for you, try to be aware and not upstage people who are really just finding their feet, because they won't necessarily know how to deal with it if you turn to them and I can't believe that you betrayed me like this. Like, your character can still be who they are without dialing it up to 11 every time,
Mhm.
or without making a speech after every combat, or without turning every social encounter into an opportunity to show off your character's accent that you've been working on. So help other people in your game that are trying to roleplay more by not pushing them out of the space.
The part of this conversation that I would add is, again, looking through a lot of the feedback that I saw around this topic. So many people mentioned, I don't want to hear about your traumatic stuff. I don't want to trivialize, emotional trauma and, all this horrible dark stuff, because that's what a lot of people who get really wrapped up in their character, I don't want to say obsess over, but they, I guess, touch upon the most. Because when you're dealing with these people, these adventurers, the characters that you play, that are going through events that are almost unrecognizable to things of our own, there is a lot of emotional baggage and damage and trauma there, right? There's also, good things on the other spectrum, but there are certainly people, maybe edgelords is kind of a somewhat applicable term in some cases, where they are just obsessed with getting all dark and emotional and mean and sad all the time. And there's a lot of discussions about that in these various posts. So if you find yourself weighing down the mood of the game because your character is afraid of cats and now you're dealing with a Tabaxi clan and you're just an emotional wreck, realize that there is a level of acceptance there, that you have to understand that you are not the main character. As much as your character is feeling this weight, it doesn't have to be at the front all the time to the point that you are deteriorating the fun for everybody else. You should be enhancing. You should be, as James said, including everybody else. And that's not to say that you should say, oh, I'm so miserable, come be miserable with me. It should be something as, oh, I'm really struggling to deal with this. Can I lean on you for a moment and have you take the spot or have you take the lead? Because my character is not capable of making decisions right now. That would be a very prominent point I would make, is there's a lot of people that get a little bit sunken in on those certain topics.
Nothing is funny all night,
Mm-hmm.
and melodrama all night
Mm-hmm.
is not satisfying either. You've got to have variety. You've got to have a mix. You've got to know when to quit.
Mm-hmm.
And those are senses that develop over time. And something that I think one of the things that makes people shy away from role playing more is being afraid to rely on the rest of the people at the table.
I think there's something that most people who picture themselves as good at role playing have a certain perspective of, oh, well, since I'm the best at role playing, I should be doing this the most, or I should be doing this the most often, or I should be taking that load, that burden, where you might be genuinely surprised if you throw the RP baggage or the weight onto someone who doesn't push it as much, and you get a response that surprises you or perhaps even outperforms you, because that is possible. That is something that I don't see a lot, but I hear about a lot, that the person who pictures themselves the improv master of the group, takes a step back and then is surprised by someone else's somewhat natural adeptness at being able to push their character forward. So that might be something you want to keep in mind and throw around as well.
Give other people room to run,
Mhm.
and a lot of the time, less is more.
Is there anything else to us to toss the ball around on, or we've kind of gotten to a conclusion?
I would just close by saying, just try it. Just say
Mhm.
yes. Give it a shot. Nobody's expecting you. I'm giving you permission. I'm giving you, viewer, permission,
Mhm.
express permission, just to give it a shot. Just try it. I don't expect you to be the man of 1,000 voices at the D&D table. Give yourself permission to play.
Yeah. I think I'll probably end off every discussion we have with play the game you want to play, communicate with your players in your DM, try your best to have the most fun as possible, and take everything with a grain of salt that we say. Tabletop role playing is a hobby that can be approached an infinite amount of ways. If you prefer some deep, dark depression hole that, I don't know, gets your rocks off, go for it. If you like traveling the universe in a school bus named Tim, go for it. Have fun. Play the game you want to play. Hopefully, something that we said gave you a little bit of insight.
So until next time, thanks for watching Natural 2 number 2.
Just rolls
Uh,
off the tongue.
yeah, subscribe, ring the bell.
Yeah. Check out His Millionth Adventures, our long-term, long-running campaign that we play in. I'm the DM and James is the player. It's also the majority of the content on this channel, but other content is being uploaded, so check that out if you are interested. But that will be it.
Until next time.